We've got a really important episode of American Black Journal coming up. We've put together a special panel of guests for a really frank conversation about the death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of Memphis police officers. We are going to talk about police reform and accountability, about racism in policing, and about the resulting trauma in Black and brown communities. You really don't want to miss today's show, so stay right there. American Black Journal starts right now.
From Delta faucets to Behr paint, Masco Corporation is proud to deliver products that enhance the way consumers all over the world experience and enjoy their living spaces. Masco, serving Michigan communities since 1929. Support also provided by the Cynthia and Edsel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Nissan Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm your host, Stephen Henderson. The beating death of Tyre Nichols by Memphis police officers is understandably raising really tough questions about police reform and accountability, as well as about racism in policing. Nichols was a 29-year-old Black man who was pulled over by police for a traffic stop. The video footage of what happens next has sparked protests all over the country and here in Detroit. The officers, who are Black, were fired and charged with second-degree murder and other felonies. I sat down for a wide-ranging conversation about the circumstances surrounding Nichols' death with Detroit's second deputy police chief, Kyra Joy Hope, Black Lives Matter Detroit co-founder John Sloan III, and licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Aisha Metzger. So, John, I'm going to start with you. For a really long time, you have been making the point that the problem we have with policing in this country is institutional and foundational, that it is about the idea of policing and it is about the sort of structural bias, inherent structural bias of policing that causes these tensions and these dangerous situations, particularly for African Americans. I guess I can't think of a better incident to highlight what you're saying and what you're talking about than the killing of Tyre Nichols. Lots of people are saying, well, this is Black police officers killing a Black man somehow is different, but it fits very squarely into the narrative that you have been trying to get people to pay attention to for some time.
Yeah, and not just me, but there have been activists across the country and across the world that have been saying this since long before I started having these conversations with you. The problem isn't the prejudicial thought. Prejudice is a problem, right? But it's the way the prejudicial thought is interwoven into systems in our country that transition prejudice into the ist or the ism, that make a prejudicial thought into racism, right? And allow that privilege and allow that social hierarchy to be maintained, that allow power to be exerted. And what we see in our system of policing is a very clear example of how when you found something on the basis of bias, when you found something on the basis of the criminalization of Black and brown bodies, that at a certain point, there becomes, there's an internalization of that thought, of that system into individuals, regardless of their racial and ethnic identity. And so what has been really, unfortunately, very clearly displayed in this situation is how this system of policing is deeply, utterly, completely at the root flawed. And I don't mean that to say that it's broken. I don't mean that to say that we need more training. I'm an advocate of anybody getting training that they think is going to help make them a better person. But when a house is built on a faulty foundation, you don't rebuild the house and paint the walls, right? And so we have right now is a very clear example of the need of a desperate and long overdue need for a new establishment and a system of safety, one that centers the most marginalized individuals in this country, and not one that's built based upon an idea that we have to prop up the current social hierarchy.
And I want to come back to you a little later and talk more about the things that you've been working on and kind of imagine for this alternative to policing. But before we get there, I want to bring Deputy Chief Hope into the conversation. What John Sloan is saying is that there is no solve for policing as we know it, and that we've got to do something else. You are one of the people who's in charge of the police department in the blackest large city in America, Detroit. 80% of the population is African American. How do you respond to this idea that the problem is policing itself, and that the things that we are doing in Detroit inside the police department to make things better essentially don't address the problem? What would your answer to that be?
So first, I'd like to say, Stephen, the actions of these officers were just disgusting and appalling for me. Excessive force is a disregard for life and has no place in law enforcement at all. And I would have to say my thoughts are with the family and every impacted by Tyre Nichols' death. I would have to say that there needs to be more accountability. There needs to be more transparency in law enforcement. There needs to be better training, intervention programs, as well as crisis intervention, mental health co-response, the data-driven enforcement. We need to come together and we need to make sure that we're open for listening to our community for the needs, as well as providing these services that we know are so desperately needed in our communities.
So I wonder, Deputy Chief, if you worry that even despite the things that you're doing and that the department is doing to address, excessive force and to address, the sort of cultural issues that we have in police departments in terms of the way that they deal with, Black and brown people, do you worry that something like what we saw in Memphis could happen here in Detroit? Do you worry that our officers, given the right circumstances, could get out of control in the same way that these Memphis officers did? I'm just curious of whether does that keep you up at night?
Stephen, I have to say, with 37 years now with the Detroit Police Department, I have to say throughout the years, we train on de-escalation. We train duty to intervene. We hold our officers accountable for their actions, and not just the officers, but the supervisors as well. I mean, everyone has a duty to intervene. I would say, no, I would not worry about that coming from our police officers from the city of Detroit. I think we are on it. I think we're hitting every avenue. That is not to say we don't have one or two that's acting out on emotion. We understand that. And that's trauma for any case, any person. But when we're talking about the training that we provide for our officers, I think de-escalation and how to handle intervention, I think that's paramount. And my answer would be no, I don't think you would see that in Detroit.
So I mean, 37 years is an interesting number to kind of reference in terms of Detroit police, because that 37 years would include the beating death of Malice Green, an African-American man stopped by two white officers who was beaten to death with one of their flashlights because he wouldn't open his hands. They thought he had drugs in the palm of his hands. So what's different, I guess,
So I would have to
today
say
that,
this,
yeah, go ahead.
Stephen, I would have to say police reform is constant. If there's something that we can do better, we're always striving to do better. We're always looking for new ways, new intervention ways to reach our officers, to train our officers. We always want to be where there's a best practice, if you will. And I just think that with our training that we're having and understanding our community, understanding what's been in the past and how we get to better policing in the future, I think all of those concepts leads to where we are today, and it makes for a much better police officer. And one, we're in the community. So you cannot take that aspect out. This is about building relationships and community trust. And we are constantly doing that. We have our neighborhood police officers who handle quality of life issues. We are walking with our social justice partners. We're out boots on the ground. We have our faith-based initiatives and organizations and partnerships that are out there. And these are things that really weren't as prevalent yesteryear as they are today. And so because of that, we stand with our partnerships and we hold each other accountable. And so I think that that is key: accountability, transparency, partnerships, and trust.
Yeah. Aisha Metzger, I want to bring you into the conversation at this point and have you talk about the damage that something like what happened in Memphis does to all people who who look like Tyre Nichols, who live in communities like Tyre Nichols, and the damage that it does to our faith in the idea that the system can work for us, that it does not pose a lethal threat to us for random and unexplained reasons.
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider what you're calling damage, right? And we know that that damage happens on multiple levels. So it happens to our minds and the ways that we're thinking about the world, as well as our emotions and our behaviors and our actions and how we're able to respond to ongoing stressors, as well as the stressors that we're currently presented with, whether that's in our community or on social media or on the news. And what we do know now is that individuals who are directly experiencing instances of police brutality, as well as those who are watching it, as well as even just having these conversations that are, people say, triggering, right? That's one of the symptoms of PTSD, or what we now know as racial trauma. So being triggered, right, that leads to rumination, that leads to thinking that this can happen to you, that leads to hypervigilance. And these are classic symptoms of PTSD that says, I'm experiencing increased worries, I'm experiencing anger in response to this, and this is a natural response that occurs. So if we think about the impact that those thoughts have on our feelings, right, you can start to feel your heart racing even. And we know that that leads to hypertension, high blood pressure, heart attack, and right, death. It might not take the 3 days that it took for Tyre, but for some of us, we're getting these days and years cut off of our lives.
You know, I have not been able to bring myself to watch the video of what happened to Tyre Nichols. And that's unusual for me. You know, it's my job as a journalist to get as much information as I can about the things that I'm presenting to the audience and talking about with the audience. And you know, as hard as it was to watch videos in the past like this, I always did it. I can't get there with this one, and I don't think I'm alone. I know that I talked to John earlier in the week, and he said he was also not watching. I wonder, in your work, what you counsel or what you are counseling people who are in that position, because I think that's kind of pervasive right now, is people don't know what to do with this.
I think it's really important to check in with yourself. Like you're saying, if you are used to watching these videos, but you're starting to notice the toll that it's taking on you. Other people will say, I'm becoming desensitized and it's not affecting me at all, so I really need to step back. right? So really just doing that self-check and then determining, okay, what can I do within my position of influence or power, or my position within my community, or even in my family, right? We know a large part of the healing that's taking place, yes, is across news and media platforms like this, but just, going home and checking in with your kids and asking them how they're coping and how they're processing and what their understanding of the justice system is, as well as their sense of safety within that system that should protect them, but doesn't look very friendly. And in the case of the media, looks deadly in most cases, right? So seeking opportunities to challenge those thoughts, seeking opportunities to unplug, disconnect, and really just tap into the love and the safety that you do have around you.
So, John, I want to come back to you and have you talk just a little about the world you imagine post-policing, what you have been working on in the last few years in particular is, as you said, an idea of public safety that is rooted in a community and does not include police. Tell us how that would work.
I think it would work very well, Stephen. And I think the evidence of that, I think every individual that I've encountered in these conversations, I think is very well-intentioned. And that well-intention aside, the comment I heard earlier concerns me around not being worried about DPD officers stepping outside of the quote-unquote boundaries. I'm terrified of that. Every time I drive down the street and pass a police officer or see lights in my rear view, I'm terrified of that because I think there's a reality that you cannot 100% foolproof anything, and especially when it's built on this root. The problem that we run into when people start talking about divesting, when people start talking about defund, and defund has turned into a dirty word of jargon, right? That people kind of toss around, is that they assume that the answer, or that the request is to tear the system down and have utter and complete chaos. I don't know anybody that's saying that out loud. I've never heard anybody say that. I'm definitely not saying that. What we practice with Black Lives Matter Detroit and with the Detroit safety team is a reimagining of safety, of community-based safety. But we've been building out with our citywide safety team is individuals who are trained in a variety of modalities and non-abusive physical and psychological intervention, who focus on being able to engage individuals and not from a place of security, right? Not from a place of responding and reacting to, but from a space of being able to be proactive and de-escalate situations appropriately, of being able to center that safety inside of a community and making sure that that community has agency over how they are held safe. And I'm being very careful not to use the word how they are policed, right? Because I don't enjoy being policed. I know very few people that enjoy being policed. And so I think if we start with this question of what is it that keeps you safe? How do you feel safe? And what are those structures that are necessary to that safety? And we start by centering the most marginalized individuals and building out safety that doesn't rely on physical intervention, that doesn't rely on being reactive, but that centers the mental and emotional health of all the individuals in that community. Then we find our way towards that path. I want to be very careful, but I don't mean to insinuate this is going to be a quick fix. I don't mean to insinuate that if somebody from the federal government decides they're going to put $100 million towards this problem tomorrow, that in 3 years, everything will be okay. It's not, right? These systems are interwoven into the fabric of our culture. And so we have to work diligently and take the time that is necessary to be able to process through them. But I definitely see a world that I might not live to see, but that is centered around how all of us can heal and how all of us can keep each other safe without the need for police intervention.
So are there public safety officers in this world that you imagine? Are there people who are responsible for making sure that public safety is upheld?
So I'm going to stay really far away from the word officer, because that's not what I see or envision. But this is not to say that things are just going to kind of be amuck and out there, right? If you look at what we've been doing at Detroit Safety Team as a very clear example, we stand up a few different services and offerings to the community and to individuals, organizations that come and seek those services. Community accountability processes, right? Mediations, the ability for us to be able to sit down with a group of individuals that have been harmed or might have received harm and work through those issues and help them try to find some source of healing on the other side. That does not mean that there is no agency within the community to be able to say, this is what safety means. That also does not mean there's no accountability, because accountability is key inside of communities, but it doesn't mean that you throw people away. It doesn't mean that we lean on a system of punishment. Doesn't mean that we lean on a carceral system that has proven to be incredibly and inherently biased. It means that we work together to build what it is that we all want to be able to see.
Yeah. Deputy Chief, what's your reaction to what John Sloan's talking about? What's wrong with that kind of vision for public safety?
Well, first of all, I think that police reform is constant. Again, I've said that if there's something that we can do better, we're going to do that better. In addition to that, specifically, when I talk about our boundaries within our officers, we as executives have to look at our officers. We need to determine if there's trauma there. We have to have supportive measures for our officers. And that's why I am so adamant about, I don't think that's going to happen in the city of Detroit, because we have great leadership here and we are focusing on the total care, not just of our officers, but our community as well. Our quality of life, the way that our citizens are being treated, is very, very important to us. And that is why we have such a great bridge between the community and the police. It's because we understand the dynamics. Our community partners understand us. We're able to have the courage to sit at the tables and have these open discussions on where we need to be. And we're listening to that. And we're putting all of our resources in there to make sure that we are safe. Our officers want to go home. Our communities want to go home, and we need to continue to be in partnerships, working together in the city of Detroit.
So when we see instances of excessive force, which we do in Detroit, just like we do in any policing agency, what's your explanation for that then? I mean, you have officers who do step over the line and act in ways that are inconsistent with what you're talking about. So why does that happen?
I can't speak on the individual mentality of an officer. I can't speak if that officer is experiencing trauma at home. But certainly when you're putting a command position, you should know your officers. You should understand what is really going on with the rank and file that you're to command over. So these kinds of things, Stephen, that you're talking about, they surface in some way, shape, or form or another. And I think peer support, care for your officers, having avenues available where we don't have to get involved, that the officer can just go to and say, I need help on this. I'm going through this. I think that's all a part of services within the police department that are necessary.
Aisha Metzger, there's a real gulf, of course, between these two positions, but I do sense that they are both centered on, at least from an individual perspective, this idea that we need better, we need more. I'm going to give you the last word, though, for this discussion about where we go from here. I mean, you do have these two really different takes on what this ought to look like in our communities.
Yeah, and even listening to this conversation, what I'll say as a clinical psychologist and as someone who often mediates tense conversations is that there's always common ground to be found. I think the common ground that we're speaking towards here is, yes, eradicating anti-Black racism, but like you're alluding to, just doing better for us as humans and as citizens in this country. And I think that as we're pointing to solutions, we can also see that, right, two things can be true. So we can work to reform and we can work to repair relationships that we have between law enforcement and everyday citizens. There are things that we can do within the law enforcement system to increase training on bystander intervention, on de-escalation. There shouldn't be a reason why a citizen who's being arrested is the one trying to de-escalate the officers. There should be increased training. There should be penalties that are swift and severe to prevent those sorts of instances from continuing. We do need increased resources towards that reform. And I do think that with increasing the diversity of officers, making sure that officers are policing in neighborhoods where they live, but also checking and challenging the systems and the climates of those units that they operate within.
That'll do it for us this week. You can find out more about our guests at AmericanBlackJournal.org, and you can always connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
From Delta faucets to Behr paint, Masco Corporation is proud to deliver products that enhance the way consumers all over the world experience and enjoy their living spaces. Masco, serving Michigan communities since 1929. Support also provided by the Cynthia and Edsel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV.
The DTE Foundation proudly supports 50 years of American Black Journal in covering African American history, culture, and politics. The DTE Foundation and American Black Journal, partners in presenting African American perspectives about our communities and in our world.
Also brought to you by Nissan Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.